If you're new with us today, I want to remind you that here at Colonial, we are in the year in the Bible. That means that for 365 days, every day, we have a prescribed reading of the Bible. We started at Genesis, and we're almost to the New Testament. If you're joining us afresh, or maybe you have kind of fallen off the track there, that's no problem. But I do want to encourage you once again to pick back up with the prophet Daniel this week. Next week, we'll be into Hosea. It's been a wonderful trip through the Old Testament. I am excited about being able to move into the New Testament, but I tell you, I have been amazed at how God continues to show up in all of these Old Testament books and just reveal the truth of the cross over and over and over again. And today will be another example of that. We're in Daniel, and I want to briefly give you a little bit of history about Daniel. This is a very important book. It is exilic prophecy. What that means is that Daniel is spending most of his time as ministry doing his prophecy and engaging the culture in exile. Remember that all of Jerusalem was conquered. I'll talk to you about those dates in a minute, but they hauled them off into the empire of Babylonia, which was the huge monster empire at that time. And so these people are far from home, and Daniel is doing his work in their midst, away from the homeland of Israel. It's in this book of Daniel that we get to learn about the king with the longest name and the hardest one to spell, and that is Nebuchadnezzar. He is a very colorful character in Daniel's account, but let me give you a little history. He reigned from 605 to 562, and this is collaborated, obviously, whatever. I mean, it's reflected in the journals of the Babylonian Empire as well. So that's 43 years. 43 years that Nebuchadnezzar is the most powerful man in the world, because the world had never known an empire like the Babylonian Empire up to that time. They were even a little greater than the Assyrians, and so on. So he's this great king, 43 years, a very huge historic figure, but only because we learn about him in the Bible, which is not Babylonian history. It's the history of God's self-revelation. Now, Nebuchadnezzar is the guy who's responsible for the fall of Judah and Jerusalem. In 597, he comes in as the great king, this huge empire, and essentially they just swap the flags. And Jerusalem becomes a vassal state of the huge empire of Babylonia. And essentially they would just loot you. They would set up kind of a puppet king to be the vassal king for the great empire. And that king's name was Zedekiah. Zedekiah was in that position for 10 years. In the first 8 years, he just kind of played ball with the Babylonian Empire. But after about the 8th year, he kind of got full of himself and thought, I think I'm going to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar. Bad idea. Nebuchadnezzar, very rageful, neurotic kind of guy, had no tolerance for insurrection. He sends his huge army back into Jerusalem and just destroys everything. They destroy all the walls of the city. They destroy the temple, all of that, so that this little peon country could never form an insurrection again against the great Babylonian Empire. And that is why in 587, 586, that we have such terrible destruction. And many of the prophets, Lamentations and so on, have all been reflecting upon this terrible destruction. It came at the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, so that's just a little bit of history. Where the Babylonian Empire is now essentially the same footprint as modern-day Iraq. And where this story takes place in Babylon, essentially would be about 85 miles south of Baghdad. So that's kind of where the geographical context of the story takes place. All that's left of it today, by the way, is a mound of dirt. That's pretty much what happens to the great empires of the world. But God's truth continues to be eternal. Now, this book, Daniel, if you are reading it, you're going to say, I kind of liked the first part of it, and then it got weird. And that's because there's different genres woven into this text. You have kind of prophetic stories, which are easy for us to read. There's a little poetry, and then you get into this apocalyptic revelation, apocalyptic prophecies, and that's kind of like reading Revelation, and it feels a little bit weird. There's a lot of imagery and so on. We'll have to circle back and unpack that at another day, but today's text is in the 3rd chapter, which is a prophetic story, which is to say it's a story that has prophetic value, points beyond itself, okay? Now, the story is one that many of us are familiar with if we've kind of grown up in Sunday school or vacation Bible school or whatnot. Any exposure you've had to Christianity as a kid, you'll probably recognize the names Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the fiery furnace. It's a very colorful story. And so it's the whole 3rd chapter, and I'm not going to read the whole third chapter. So if you'll turn in your Bibles to the third chapter, I'm going to give you the cliff notes. Okay, I'm just going to just sum it up for you. So you have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they're three Jewish men who have been plucked out of Jerusalem, out of Judah, probably about 597. They were young boys, maybe 10, 11 years old, and they were recognized as having kind of above average intelligence and potential. And this is what the Babylonian aristocracy did. They would pick the best of the best out of every little country that they conquered, and they put them into training camp for about 3 years and get them indoctrinated into, the leadership role and develop them, and then put them in positions of increasing levels of authority to manage the state. And so that's where they've been, including Daniel. We're going to hear a lot about Daniel in this chapter. So they're kind of in there with this new system, and they've got positions of responsibility, and Nebuchadnezzar's happy with their performance, except that one day Nebuchadnezzar decides, I'm going to build this 90-foot gold monstrosity of a statue of an idol. It's 9 feet wide. It's just gigantic. And when the musicians start to play, here's the edict, everybody, you bow down before this huge monstrosity, okay? And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, being good Jewish men, say, we're not going to do it. We will not bow before that big honking idol. And so, some people tattle on them, and Nebuchadnezzar calls them in and says, guys, I like you, but I don't think you really understand the rules here. Here it is. When the music plays, you bow before my idol. And if you don't, I'm going to throw you into a fiery furnace. And then, what kind of God's going to save you from that? And they respond and say, we really don't have to defend ourselves here, and we're not going to. We're not going to argue with you. It's just that the God we love is so powerful that he can save us, and even if he doesn't, we're still not going to bow. And that really makes Nebuchadnezzar mad. So he gets the fire super, super hot. They throw him in there. He sits back in his recliner at a nice vantage point to watch the guys burn. And then he notices that there's a fourth person in the fire. And he says, who is that fourth person in the fire? It looks like a son of the gods. And they're walking around and talking, and nobody's getting burnt. And it says, when they came out, they didn't even smell like smoke. There wasn't even a hair on their head that was fringed. And so Nebuchadnezzar's pretty convinced in the power of their God, and the story ends by him saying, hey, anybody who says a bad word against my Jews, my boys here and their God, I'm going to chop them into pieces. And then he gives them a promotion, and the story ends. And that's the way it goes. You can read it. Now, why are we looking at this story? In any given audience of people who have come to reflect theologically, whether you believe in God or not, we're going to have those people who believe in the exclusive claims of Jesus Christ as the God of the universe and the one who died for us. And then we're going to have a bunch of other people who say, well, yeah, I might believe that, or that might work for me, but I'm not really sure that everybody else has to believe that. Everyone else kind of has their own religion and culture. And we call that pluralism, okay? And then for skeptics, this concept of the religious insistence that you're right is called religious intolerance. And that's a real deal breaker for skeptics, people who, especially modern contemporary thinkers. It's just like, why do you have to be so arrogant to say that your way is the only way and you're so right and everyone else is wrong? And so we're going to deal with this question of religious intolerance today. And the second big deal breaker for skeptics is the reality of suffering. If your God is so good, why does everybody suffer so much and so on? And so in this little story, it is just an amazing treatment of these two subjects. And so as I go through the message today, there are basically three subtitles. Number one is religious pluralism versus religious totalitarianism, using big words. I can hardly even say it, but it means something. I'll come back to that in a second. The biblical response to both, and then three, a final thought on suffering. First, this concept of religious pluralism versus religious totalitarianism. Go back to the story. Right there in the beginning, King Nebuchadnezzar presents this huge image of gold, 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide. But we have no idea what this image looks like. One could assume that it's an image of the king, but it doesn't say that. We don't know that this is king worship. And it says in verse 12, when the people tattle on the three men, it says this, it says, they neither serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. So what that tells us is that it's not like Nebuchadnezzar said, I'm going to pick the state religion and it's going to be my preferred religion, my preferred set of gods. There's nothing to say that this represents Nebuchadnezzar's preferred religion. What is it then? It's the national idol. You see, when you're a big empire and you start conquering all these little countries, what happens is that you're just putting your flag over all these different little countries who all have their own cultures and their own little religions and religious practices and so on. And so you really have two choices. Either you kind of hold a gun to everybody's head and said, you're going to believe our state religion, you're going to conform your behavior to our state religion and culture. That's one option. That would be totalitarianism. And I'll come back to that in a second. Or you can say, you know what, it's cool. Everybody can do your own thing. Everyone, just religious freedom. You can worship whoever you want, however you want, that's fine. But you must also bow down to the national deity. You see, the national deity is Nebuchadnezzar's way to try to create this glue that's going to hold us all together. It's kind of like the flag. Does this sound familiar? Well, it should, because this is kind of where we are in America. And I'm not throwing our country under the bus at all. I'm not throwing the First Amendment under the bus at all, because, I think it kind of probably has to work this way, right? And that is that we have religious freedom. America is a hodgepodge of people from all over the world, lots of different religions, and our law says, hey, everybody can worship their own God and in peace, and we hold that to be very dear and sacred. And that is a good thing. Here's the problem. When living in a religiously diverse, pluralistic society, when one religion stands up and says, yeah, but our God is the one true God, and that's true for all times, all places, and this is history, and it's true. Absolutely true. By virtue of them saying it's absolutely true, what they're saying is all the other truth claims of religion are false. And in a religious, diverse, pluralistic society, people look around and say, well, that's mighty arrogant. You're mighty intolerant. That's true for you. How do you know it's true for the person over here? The person over here, it's not true for me. So why can you say that you're right and I'm wrong? What makes you think that you have the market, the monopoly on the truth? And so that's a problem for us as Christians, isn't it? Because the God that we worship, the text that we read says, go and tell them, make people disciples, lead them to understand the truth of the gospel, that they might be changed and transformed by it, and they become disciples. And we say, well, kind of, but we live in America, and that's not the way it works. It's a pluralistic society. We need to respect everybody else's different beliefs. We can't just kind of be projecting our belief on somebody else. So we have this problem with religious pluralism. And I just want to speak to that for a second, because it's kind of an ironic reality that religious pluralism begins at first blush to say, isn't that tolerant? It's so inclusive of everybody. Everyone kind of just do your own thing. We all get along. Well, maybe. What religious pluralism is actually saying is we're all going to get along best if we all just kind of do our things and don't talk much about it, and certainly don't try to make anybody else think the way that you do. And behind that is an assumption that says, it's really okay if you worship your God as long as I don't have to worship your God. And what's really the assumption beneath that says, because since you can't know that your God is true and you can't show me that my God is false, anytime you try to convert me to your faith, you're just being arrogant and intolerant. Now, if you think this way, or people that you know think this way, here's what they're actually saying. My worldview is right, your worldview is wrong. They're saying, you see, you don't understand. Here's the truth. There is no truth. Here's the truth. You can't really know truth. Here's the truth. I know that there's no actual truth in your religion. There's no real actual truth in my religion or anybody else's for that matter. And so the only truth is that there's no truth. Or at least we can't know it. Now, if you stand in the marketplace or you stand in a college classroom and you talk that way, everyone's going to be like, oh boy, that person's intellectual. That's really bright. Okay? But if a critical thinker hears you say that, here's what they're going to think. Okay, wait, let me make sure I understand you. You're saying that there is no truth. And that's why we also just kind of leave each other alone and everyone do their own thing, because actually none of it's true. But that's a truth claim. And so that makes you like the hugest hypocrite ever. Religious pluralism is a way to be nice, but it has nothing to do with the truth. And for you to say that there is no truth, and then condemn people for being, insistent that their truth is right, and you condemn them as being intolerant, who's really intolerant? You're intolerant because you're so convinced that your worldview is right that you're not even open to anybody saying, no, this is actually true, because you've already assumed that it's not. Okay, I lost you. Sorry. The point is that if you are truly Christian, if we actually believe in Jesus Christ as the Son of God who was raised from the dead, we cannot be pluralist. We just can't. We have to follow in obedience. We have to testify that we worship the one true God, period. It's history. It's an immutable fact. And it's true for all people in all cultures, in all times and places. And it's not relative upon your experience or whether you're raised in America or raised, in Japan or China or wherever. It's just the truth. But we live in this religious pluralistic society, so we feel uncomfortable with that. Why is pluralism so popular today? Let me tell you. Religious pluralism is usually a response and reaction to religious totalitarianism. What is that? Totalitarianism really is a long word, but it's a very simple concept. And basically it means forced allegiance. Forced allegiance. Examples of religious totalitarianism would be the Roman Catholic Church in the Dark Ages, where you could be burned. You could be completely outcast and exiled from society. You were forced to pay tax to support the church and the construction, so on and so forth. It was a lot of manipulation. There was a lot of threat. It's forced conformity to the prevailing religious, political, societal views and behaviors that's expected by those who are in control of all the power. The Nazis in Germany, another perfect illustration of a totalitarian of government. And even in many Islamic states, not all of the Islamic states today, but in many, you dare not speak out against the state. You dare not express a differing opinion in terms of religious views or not conform to the cultural expectations, or you could get put in jail or even killed. And so religious totalitarianism is well documented, and religious pluralism is a response to that. I don't want religion shoved down my throat. I don't want to feel like I'm threatened, like you're going to put me in jail or you're going to tell me I'm going to burn in hell just because I don't agree with you. So you have this tension. And I just, for a minute, I just need to say, some of us were raised in environments where the gospel was preached in a totalitarian way. Kind of a fundamentalistic, very legalistic, very angry, hot, sweaty preacher saying, you do this or you don't do that or whatever, or you're going to burn in hell forever. I mean, I literally had a church member one day, he walked into a church, he was holding his NIV Bible. It's one of these churches. And the pastor, as he's walking out the door, he said, well, you're going to go to hell reading that NIV. And the guy goes, you got to be kidding me. And he goes, I'm not kidding at all. There's only one authoritative version of the Bible, and that's the King James Version. And if that's not what you're reading, you will burn in hell. See, that's totalitarian. That's very, very offensive to any person who's a thinking person. And you know what? We don't need that in America. We have choices. And my choice is I'll never walk into that church again. In fact, I may never walk into any church again. So religious pluralism is often a response to religious totalitarianism. Ironically, religious pluralism actually can lead to totalitarianism. And that's almost where we're at in America today. We've taken religious pluralism and the freedom of expression of religion so far, to such a degree, that if anyone actually does stand up and say, no, this is the truth, they're persecuted. Because you can't say that. Because our national God, our national deity, the thing that we all want to accept is there is no truth. And if you don't bow at that God and agree with that worldview, you can be persecuted for standing up and saying, no, but this is actually, Jesus Christ is the Son of God. It's offensive. People consider it arrogant and so on. Now, the true Christian can either be a pluralist or totalitarian. And I'll come back and unpack that a second. So what is the biblical response to these two realities? Well, beautifully, in this story, we have a great example of both. You have this highly pluralistic society, but then you have the king saying, if you don't bow to the national God, you will burn in our furnace. We're going to throw you into the furnace, so, love me. Love my country. Everybody bow. And then even at the end of the story, after God rescues Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the fires, they come out, he says, wow, your God is powerful. Anybody who says anything against their God, I'm going to chop them to pieces. Right? So his totalitarianism behavior never really changes. He's just kind of dysfunctional that way. But this is the environment, pluralistic and totalitarian, at the same time. What a beautiful case study for how we deal with this. So we look at Daniel 3, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego model for us an appropriate and faithful response to both pluralism and totalitarianism. First of all, pluralism, when they're taken in exile and moved to a different culture, and this is a prevailing culture, a huge monster, it's the nation to be in right now, they defect. How do they defect? They defect in the foods that they eat. They defect in the way that they live. They defect in not bowing to the national norm, in not bowing to that huge national iconic, everything, that binds us together as one country. They're just not going to do it. They're going to say, we are going to differentiate ourselves by the way we behave, by the way we live. And this is critical for a Christian response to a pluralistic society. We must defect. The world must see in us something different. The way that we live, the way we speak, the way we choose to spend our money, all of it is the way that we stand firmly in a faithful response to our loving God and bear witness to a very pluralistic world. We actually worship a God who's true. How do we know? Because it affects everything about the way that we live. And then we don't apologize when we're challenged on that. And that's the next thing that happens. Nebuchadnezzar says, I don't think you understand the rules. The music plays, you bow or you burn. This is their response, verse 16. O king, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this manner. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Now, this is courage. It's a deep level of faith. It's a spiritual maturity that goes beyond believing God exists to bless my agenda. God exists to make me feel good. God exists to heal me from my diseases. God exists to help me get a job. God exists to help me somehow pay my mortgage and raise good kids. And if God's not existing all of that, to bless my agenda, I don't really believe in God. See, they've moved beyond that. Certainly, they give God all the glory for all of their blessings and riches of their life. But now, see, they're ready to say, I believe so much that God is real, the one absolute true God, that I'm willing to suffer just to say I believe. I'm willing to endure suffering and death simply to say I believe, and I'm not going to bow to your national God. You see, this is powerful, and it brings me to this last point because this is huge. In their suffering, in their willingness to suffer, they are proclaiming the gospel, the good news of the one true God in the way that they live their life, in their willingness to lose, their willingness to suffer. St. Francis of Assisi says, proclaim the gospel at all times, and when necessary, use words. They don't engage in a theological diatribe. They just said, we believe, and we're willing to die simply to say, we believe in the one true God, and we are not going to bow. It introduces this question of suffering. Now, when they're ready and willing to be thrown into this fire, because they stand on the conviction that we don't believe a God, we believe in the God, period, something just unbelievable happens. There's Nebuchadnezzar, he's got his easy chair, we're going to have a nice day of watching people burn. They throw him into the fire, and suddenly there's a fourth person in the fire, and he says unwittingly, that fourth person looks like a son of the gods. In other words, it's somebody sent by God who looks like he's of God, and he does something like God because the men don't burn. It says when they come out, they don't even smell like smoke. And he calls them to come out. Now, let me ask you a question. Who's the fourth guy in the fire? I'll submit to you that is a pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. You're like, oh, hold on. That's just not until the New Testament. You can't just skip over to the New Testament. This is the Old Testament. All right? Let me explain to you why. Look at verse 28. King Nebuchadnezzar says, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and denied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any God except their own God. I mean, that's the powerful witness, willing to suffer and die and to just worship and serve the one true God. And then he kind of relapses into his totalitarian ways and threatens to chop people up if they speak against the Jews. But then at the very end, he says this very interesting thing. He says, "For no other God can save in this way." Okay, what is he saying? Watch. Okay, if I'm God or if you're God, and you've got your chosen people, and you've called them to be faithful, and they have been faithful, and now the bad guys are fixing to throw them into a fire. You've got the world at your fingertips of options on how to respond. And let's just go through a few ways. Number one, we take the fire and we throw it on all the bad guys, and they all burn up, and these three are saved, right? That would be an option. Or we go, and we just blow the fire out, and every time they light it, we just blow it, and we're just having fun, like the breath they can, you know? I mean, that would be fun. That would be a way to do that. If you're God, you're powerful. There's so many different ways you can express your power and your might in saving these three guys. But see, watch this. How does this God, the one true God, save? He enters into the fire with them. Emmanuel, God with us. How do I know that the fourth man in the fire is Jesus Christ? Because this is the way God saves. He saves with us. Look, remember Luke, right? Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and Luke testifies that while he's kneeled down and he's praying before God, he's sweating. He's sweating so hard that it looks like drops of blood falling to the ground. And the great pastor and theologian Jonathan Edwards said many, many years ago, he said, what was happening there is that Jesus Christ stood before the blazing fiery furnaces of God's wrath. You see, because a truly holy and just God demands somebody's got to burn. Somebody has to die in order for justice to be fulfilled. And here's the truth of the gospel, that Jesus Christ willingly enters into the fire of the hottest fiery furnace in history ever throughout eternity on our behalf. You see, Christ suffers the fires of hell. He suffers the fire of God's wrathful judgment. He suffers the fire for us so that he might suffer in the fires of our life with us. This is how God saves. When he says no other God saves this way, he's absolutely correct. Because there's not another religion in history, there's no other religious claim anywhere, any philosophy, any world religion, where God suffers for you or with you. There was a philosophy professor from Yale named Nicholas Wolterstorff who wrote a book a few years ago called Lament for a Son. And in it, he just journaled his pain after losing his 25-year-old boy in a hiking accident. It's just devastating. It's a very hard read. But he's very honest. But in the midst of that book and towards its conclusion, he says this. He says, God is love. That is why he suffers. He says, the one who doesn't see God suffering does not know about his love. And the last part of that quote says, the tears of God are the meaning of history. Why can't we be pluralistic? Because we worship a God who has defined himself in history over and over and over again. It's not a philosophy. It's not just some random thing. It's history. And he is the one true God. Why can't we be totalitarian? Why can't we threaten people? Because our message is not a threatening message. Our message is, look at the God who dies for you. Look at the God who suffers for you. Look at the God who enters into the furnace. Look at the God who hangs on the cross. He loves you that much. You know, I mean, Wolterstorff's whole point is, I know as a father that the minute my child was born, every time he smiled, I smiled. And when he cried, I cried. And when he hurt, I hurt. Because that's what it is to love. You both rejoice and suffer with the one whom you love. And I get that as a father. And when I watch God sending his son, Jesus Christ, on the cross, I get it. See, God suffers for us so that he might suffer with us. The good news is not, believe the way I believe or you're going to burn in hell. The good news is, look at the God who suffers for you so that you might have the hope that in your life right now, in your broken marriage, with your kids going off this deep end and the foreclosure coming, you haven't had a job for so long or whatever it is, he's in the fire with you now. And I don't know what your fire is. But if you don't actually know Jesus Christ is the truth, if you don't actually understand the suffering of God for you and with you, then you think you're in that fire by yourself. And you've got nobody to look for because, it's just one of lots of different religions, and yeah, it might work for you, but it doesn't all work for, or you just kind of dismiss this one and start looking for the next one because you don't actually believe. You actually don't believe that God is God. The three men, as they walked into the fire, they didn't know that Jesus was going to meet them there. They thought they were going to die. But when they're willing to stand upon a firm conviction of the one true God and into that fire, here's the truth of the gospel. He comes and gets in the fire with us. He saves us by getting in the fire for us and then standing with us. If you have never picked up on the absolute truth of the gospel, then you can't know how much God loves you. You can't know how much God desires to suffer with you, alongside of you, and to save you from that fire, all to his glory. If you've never received Jesus Christ, you need to give in on the religious pluralism. It leads you down a bunny trail. It leads to religious totalitarianism, the very thing you hate. And receive the one true God who died for you that he might suffer with you. Will you pray with me? Lord, it's not rocket science. Over and over and over again, for thousands of years, you've just been revealing the same thing over and over and over again. You love us. You love us more than any parent has ever loved any child. And you've gone to such great lengths. You've given us your very heart. You've taken on the very fire of the judgment that we deserve for all the sin, all the injustice of the world. You made that right yourself by taking on that suffering, so that in this life, even now, when we enter into these fires of our everyday realities, you are with us. And if we will claim that promise to be true, then we will see you at work in our lives, even in the midst of our suffering. And the profound truth, Lord, that as we suffer, we become a little bit more like you. What a great honor. And so, Lord, help us to embrace the suffering in which we are. First of all, that we're not alone. And second, that it helps us to become more like you. That we get to shine the light to the whole world and say, even though I suffer, even if it costs me my life, I will not bow before the national God, because it is no God. We worship the one true God, the truth, the cross, the center of all history. May we be bold in sharing that light with all those who don't know. In the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.